Our featured guest tonight helped create one of the quintessential sounds of the progressive rock movement of the 70s. His time in the band Genesis led to world tours, countless hits, and would eventually spawn a solo career for himself and many of his bandmates that would find success all its own. Here to chat about his incredible music career is none other than world-famous guitarist Steve Hackett. Steve, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much. Lovely to talk. Thank you.
So it's obvious from the career paths of both you and your brother John that creativity runs in the family. I mean, what do you make of that? I mean, where do you think that came from?
Well, both sides of the family. My father played a lot of different instruments just for fun, and on my mother's side, there are musicians. The Jewish side of the family, there are musicians. So there's quite a lot in the genes, believe me, of all of that. So luckily, we both went professional with it, whereas others maybe were army buglers and drummers and various things. My dad was able to play a number of things, bugle and clarinet and harmonica, which he passed on to me. When I was a kid, I was trying to be just like him from the age of 2 onwards with harmonica. So music was always very important to me from a very, very, very young age.
When I was 13, I read To Kill a Mockingbird, and that inspired me to become an attorney. What inspired you to pursue music as a career? Was it your father?
As I say, yes, I think it was. There was always music in the household, and of course, I was born in the days before rock and roll. I was born in 1950, so that meant that radio was extremely varied. A lot of it was forces radio just after the war. What you would have is these sort of family favorites to different postings in what used to be the British Empire, and so radio would have a diet of Glenn Miller 1 minute, Elvis Presley the next. Actually, maybe I'm not sure that Elvis had arrived on the scene quite at that point, but you would get some Gluck, you would get some, in other words, you get classical music, some big band, pop music. It was all just light entertainment before it had become specialized, and so you could have anything on radio at that point in time. Don't forget, we only had 2 radio stations in Britain at this time. We only had the Home Service, which was for current affairs, news, all of that, and the Light program, which covered absolutely everything else. So not a lot of choice in those days of standardization. But of course, it was all to change, and you always had a huge variety, I gather, in America, or so it seemed to us, which is why we Brits were always looking to America for inspiration, and I still do.
I read that one of the albums that had a huge impact on you was Bob Dylan's Highway 61 Revisited.
Yes.
What made that album so special in your mind?
Well, I think he was working with a great band at that time. And so I think that having been, a one-man show up to that point, had a band that had various talents in Mike Bloomfield on guitar, Al Cooper on keyboards. Yes, and I think the combination of those two when they were working with other people was a great mix. Of course, in the mid-1960s, I'd seen Mike Bloomfield working live with the Paul Butterfield Blues Band, and that was an incredible combination as far as I was concerned. But I was unaware at that time that Mike was working with Bob Dylan, and I gather latterly Bob Dylan said that Mike Bloomfield was his favorite guitarist. So I think that Mike had obviously infused that combo with a lot of energy, and that was what I got off stage when I was watching him live. With Butterfield was an incredible frontman harmonica player, and his band sported 2 great guitarists, Bloomfield and Elvin Bishop. So they were great. The night that I saw them, they were all absolutely on fire.
And we had Al Cooper on the show probably about a year ago. And he, kind of like you, is kind of like a walking encyclopedia of music history. I mean, he's had his hands in, I mean, there's like 3 degrees of separation between him and like everything.
Yes.
And just an incredible keyboard player. So early days of your career, you put out an ad in the magazine Melody Maker, advertising your services and seeking a band. Peter Gabriel of Genesis responds. When you think back on that moment, what sticks out in your mind?
Well, the truth is, I'd been advertising myself for 5 years, and so it was no overnight success. The wording of my ads became more and more specific and outrageous, and that's what I think attracted Pete. He could tell I was a committed, eccentric idealist like himself, and I think that's what really got me the gig. I didn't really know who Genesis were at the time. I hadn't heard of Peter Gabriel. You have to remember this was 1970, and they were up and running and they were doing gigs, but maybe not for long. So I was shortly to become enlightened, of course. And they were a great band to join. Great band then, great band now, and with a great frontman at the time, who was Peter Gabriel, who managed to personify so many of the songs in a convincing and entertaining way. He would take huge risks. At the same time, I was interested in that band expanding to the point where we had our own light show and a Mellotron and expanded keyboard arsenal. So I thought about other things. I didn't just have my ear and eye on the guitar. I was interested in how we presented ourselves. So I probably was hugely critical when I first joined them because I felt I had nothing to lose. 5 years of ads later, I imagined that my tenure with Genesis was going to last about 5 seconds, never mind the 6 or 7 years I spent with them.
So you're then in the band. You enter the studio with them for the first time with Nursery Cryme. When all the instruments and vocals came together and you heard the final masters, how did that? What was your feeling at that moment?
I was very pleased with the album because I'd done an album 1 year earlier with another band, but we'd done no shows. And the lovely thing about that was I could tell that it was done to a high professional standard. I'm not talking about perfection because standards have changed since then. But I think we had something that it's funny because John Lennon gave an interview and said that we were one of the bands that he considered to be true sons of the Beatles. And when I subsequently listened back to some of those early efforts, particularly with Foxtrot, I can tell that there's a Beatle influence. It's subtle at times, but there'll be times when it's me doing something that perhaps George Harrison might have done on guitar. So George was a big influence. The Beatles were a huge influence. So when I look back on my time, I realized that we were the sum of our influences and trying to bite through the chains of or the shackles of whatever it was that was holding us back, with a fair amount of the anxiety of influence, of course, that goes in attendance with all of that. But that stays with you for life.
Well, what was the origin of your iconic guitar tapping method? I mean, where did those ideas come from?
Well, I was trying to play one line from something I'd heard from Bach, and I realized that the quickest way to do it, the most efficient way, was to play it all on one string, where you were hammering on and off with both hands. I tapped on and off with the nail. Subsequently, I sometimes do it with the pad of the finger. It all depends on which string you're after. If it's going to be the first string, I'll be using the pad of the nail. This is probably more information you need, but it has spawned.
My son will dig it because he's a guitarist. And he already kind of knew about it. So this may be a selfish question, honestly.
Well, it's become part of the either the glossary of terms or it's expanded the references for guitarists. Basically, as part of guitar language, it's part of guitar shredding language. That's how it is. You're using the whole of the fretboard rather like a keyboard. So it was a keyboard player that influenced me in the first place in the shape of the glorious Johann Sebastian Bach.